Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar that we're in today. It's focused on community transport. I'm Leanne Breger. I'm the Programs Director for iMove CRC. Just some housekeeping before we kick off. Please, can you keep your mics on mute if you aren't speaking? And please keep the questions coming through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. A very short introduction to iMove. We're a national centre for transport and mobility collaborative R&D. We were founded by the federal government and its partners to undertake projects that create safer, cleaner, more equitable and efficient transport in Australia. Benefit to the community is very much at the core of the work that we do at iMove. The understanding created in the community transport project that we are discussing today will hopefully progress thinking in this area. I would like to welcome the panelists today. We have Tracy Ryan, who is the Policy Manager at ITS Australia. We have Ben Whitehorn, who is the CEO of the Randwick Waverley Transport Community Group. We have Simon Anthonis, the Chief Operating Officer for Orcoda. We have Peter Lee, who is the Senior Manager, Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney. I'll hand over to Stacey now to give us some background on the project's origins. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A. Over to you, Stacey.
Thanks, Leanne, and thanks so much to iMove for supporting this project. It's been a really fun ride with all of our stakeholders. It's a big group of people that we've been working with. We were so lucky to get support from our government partners. So that's Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, DOT in Western Australia, and Department of Transport in Victoria, as well as Transport for New South Wales. So that's a really impressive group of organisations to get together to try to, I suppose, grapple with the really wicked problem that is community transport. The title of it is Community Transport for the Future or Accelerating Community Transport. These are all big ambitions. But fundamentally, and Peter can talk to this in more detail, but one of the things we got to grips with was what is community transport? And I suppose you might ask, why is ITS Australia, which is a transport technology peak group, focusing on community transport of all things? But there's a really strong collective goal in transport and transport technology to grapple with the challenges that improve transport opportunities for all of us, and working on that accessibility and equitable transport delivery and how technology can enable that is really where we're meeting at the core of, our, I suppose, social license and the way that we want to operate and the things that we want to do. And just purely from a how do we get better transport? If we can solve transport issues for people that have higher transport needs or are transport disadvantaged, then we all get better outcomes. So I'll leave that there, and I'll talk about at the end about what we're going to do next. But I'll hand over to Peter to take us through how we worked through the last 12 months or so.
Yeah, thank you, Stacey. I'm just going to present some slides, if that's okay, and I'll use this opportunity to kind of talk to the research to really tee up the discussion. So as Leanne said, I'm Senior Manager of the Advisory Team at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance. We're an independent research consulting and teaching institute based at UTS. In the interest of time, I'll skip the background on me and on the institute today, but do please reach out to me if you want to know more about us. Given the breadth of ground we covered in the research, I won't present all the findings in any great detail today, and I would encourage you to have a look at the full kind of research report which came out this morning. For now, I'll just give an overview of the kind of key research findings before we get into the discussion. I'll probably talk for about 15 minutes or so. So the idea for the projects really came from Stacey and ITS Australia, who approached us about conducting the research. And as others have already said, and I won't reiterate, it was run as a collaborative project through iMove with the partners on screen. Just kind of building on what Stacey said, from our point of view, kind of conducting the research, the aim was really to develop a strategic perspective on community transport in a way that perhaps kind of hasn't been done before. So really we were looking at holistically reviewing CT in Australia, looking at identifying relevant technology and innovation trends, but also trying to assess the systemic challenges facing the sector and identifying where some of the barriers and opportunities for innovation are. So the intent of this was really not necessarily trying to provide new news to the CT sector itself, but trying to provide insights to other stakeholders in government and industry, as well as parts of the sector around what CT is all about, how it works, some of the key challenges, and where some of the potential opportunities are. Another thing worth mentioning really is the research deliberately didn't set out to try and recommend solutions. A lot of these problems are very complex and cross-cutting, certainly the ones that came out of the research. I think really what this research is about is to try and uncover what some of those key issues are and establish a bit of a basis and a bit of a burning platform for some further discussion and action, and I'm sure Stacey and others will talk more about that a bit later. In terms of what we actually did, just from a practical point of view, the bulk of the research really involved 3 parallel literature and evidence reviews, which looked at quite a large body of international evidence, and 40 semi-structured interviews with government, CT organisations, transport and tech industry, and other user group stakeholders. We also ran some workshops with CT providers, with government and industry, did some demographic modelling and some other analysis. But really what this research is trying to do is to bring together quite a large body of existing evidence with some new qualitative and quantitative research. So just getting on to the findings, in terms of looking strategically at community transport, it was important for us to kind of start with the underlying context of need. So issues around transport disadvantage and complex mobility needs that entails. At a very simple level, transport disadvantage essentially refers to difficulties in accessing and using transport. Obviously, some of the impacts of that can be quite serious in terms of the implications for economic participation, social inclusion, health and well-being, but also some of the kind of major downstream costs that can impose on society. Obviously, government has a role in addressing some of those things, and it does so through investing in public transport infrastructure and services, improving transport accessibility, exploring more innovative transport options, as well as funding transport supports for people that need mobility assistance. I guess part of what the research is trying to highlight is those are all useful things, but transport disadvantage in the round is a very complex cross-cutting issue. And while a lot of the research from the last 10 or 20 years in that area has given us a decent theoretical understanding of the factors that impact transport disadvantage, in practical terms, the actual community needs around that are pretty poorly understood, and also largely tackled through piecemeal solutions, especially when you look at that kind of through a transport lens. So in a specific kind of community transport context, what the research showed was kind of older people, people living with disability, and people living outside major cities were particularly relevant groups. But that was kind of for 2 reasons. One was, they're among the most likely to actually have trouble accessing and using other transport services, but also a lot of the key policy and funding programs that exist are aligned to provide supports for those groups. And therefore, a lot of community transport is structured to respond to those policies and those programs, rather than necessarily, thinking holistically about where the community need is. And that's not a failing of community transport. That's a broader systemic issue, and I'll get onto a little bit of that in a minute. But the other point is, while it's a problem today, Australia faces a challenge around future needs for assisted mobility, which is kind of set to grow quite substantially, within the next 10 years. So obviously, we all know there's an aging population, and as the population ages, most people will, more people are going to need mobility assistance because, at the end of the day, as people age, the prevalence of disability is higher, or the likelihood of encountering health issues, cognitive impairments, or other barriers to mobility all increase. At the same time, there's this shift in Australia towards more people aging in the community. So there's a clear trend towards aging in place. So for example, the number of people using home care has already tripled in the last 10 years. And that in turn is going to place increasing demand for, and also importance of, personal mobility for older people. Added to that, those issues are particularly going to be acutely felt probably in regional and remote Australia. But at the same time, it's not, this isn't all about aging. For example, none of this takes account of the needs of other groups in the community that are already perhaps going unrecognised or underserviced. So in terms of community transport specifically, as has already been alluded to, there's no single definition. It's a very diverse and disaggregated sector. providers are numerous, very widely in size, scale of operations, types of service, as well as the types of organisations and business models that are at work. All of which makes it hard to try and put a boundary around the sector or assess what the definitive numbers of providers are, how many customers there are, how many trips take place, and so on. There's estimates out there, but none of them are kind of definitive. What we did try to do was distill some common characteristics around community transport, which included things like the emphasis that CT places on equity, inclusion, and social justice in meeting needs that aren't being well served by other forms of transport. Also, its role as a care and community service, not just a transport service. The fact that services are highly personalised, very tailored and door-to-door in a way that many other transport services aren't. But also its broader role in connecting people to healthcare and into their community, the kind of social inclusion that comes alongside that, but also then in the way services are delivered. So they're kind of often community-based, not-for-profit, and oftentimes kind of volunteer-driven nature of services. Similarly, there's some understanding of where the kind of major areas of cost are for delivering CT. So things like staffing, training, fleet, fuel, compliance and administration costs, but there's still very little reliable evidence on actually what the costs of service are. Similarly, there's not much kind of hard quantifiable data around the value and the benefits that CT delivers, but there is a lot of broader evidence on the social value that CT offers. So its function as a critical component of social and community service infrastructure is something that emerged really strongly from the research in providing that kind of essential support where conventional private or public transport isn't viable or appropriate, in enabling kind of equitable access to health, social, and community care services, as well as economic and social participation for that kind of sliding scale of vulnerable and disadvantaged segments of the population. But also as an important enabler of a wide range of policy goals and funding programs. And part of the issue for community transport is, while these are all things that are widely acknowledged within the sector, they're often not that well communicated or understood outside the sector. And part of the function for the research was trying to convey this is the value that we think community transport offers and why it matters. There are a few studies around that have attempted to try and quantify that value, and typically returns figures of the order of $8 to $23 per dollar invested, but there's not a lot of quantified or specific evidence around that beyond those few studies. So I guess from a kind of policy point of view, CT occupies this kind of tricky position at the nexus of transport, health, aged care, disability, social, community services. And those different policy domains and the ways they kind of seek to address kind of transport issues, they're all looking to address barriers to access and mobility, often for kind of specific user cohorts, user needs or types of service. And in many of those contexts, transport's just one of a wider suite of needs and services that they're trying to address. So while transport assistance might be common to all of them, the way this has kind of grown up means the systems evolved to cater for those needs independently, which has kind of given rise to this kind of suite of siloed programs and a kind of fragmented policy, regulatory and funding landscape for community transport, which sits across federal, state, local, community levels, as well as various kind of policy domains. Separately to that, and as already been touched on, kind of technology and service innovation relevant to CT was a kind of key focus area for this research. So I won't go into huge amounts of detail. Our report says much more about individual trends and some of the benefits and considerations associated with those that we came up with. But broadly speaking, we identified a range of emerging technologies, as well as some new applications of more established technologies that are already happening within community transport, either in Australia or internationally. And that spans a lot of the things you might expect, like robotics, automation, electrification, but overwhelmingly it was about digital and ICT and kind of software solutions. But alongside that, there were lots of good examples of service innovation, which are highly relevant, and some of that was about integrating technology, things like software as a service type models, but also a lot of things in their sort of partnership and funding model, or cost sharing, or other kinds of collaborative kind of service models, all of which we think are kind of particularly important. Before I kind of move on, the other thing I suppose that was interesting was the role that kind of COVID played in providing a bit of a catalyst for a lot of providers to sort of shift to new technology. So, I mean, things like digital payment systems or other forms of technology, but You know, COVID's obviously had some huge impacts in a number of ways, but from a technology point of view, that was an interesting observation. So that's kind of a very, very quick scamper through kind of some of the findings about community transport. I'll just kind of finish by talking a bit about the systemic challenges that we kind of took away from the research, and then move on to just briefly talk about some of the opportunities that kind of arise from that. So in terms of the systemic challenges, they broadly related to, first of all, challenges around community needs, especially the overall lack of evidence and understanding around the community needs for assisted mobility, as well as where there's already existing evidence that there's currently unmet needs and mismatches between supply and demand. As I've already touched on, the fragmented system around all of this was a major theme that came out of the research, especially associated with those kind of complex regulatory funding regimes, the policy silos and the single purpose programs, rather than a sort of systemic approach to assisted mobility. But associated with that, some of the major constraints for the sector around funding certainty and efficiency, especially given the asset intensive nature of a lot of what community transport providers have to do. But even from a customer point of view, some of the kind of barriers to access in terms of having to navigate various programs, eligibility requirements, access to services, or unequal levels of support for transport, and those sorts of things. Something else that came out of it was some of the kind of emerging changes going on to the market that's impacting community transport, and in particular expected to increase some of the competition for the sector. Notably, two things were around the kind of anticipated aged care funding reforms that are going through at the moment, but also the broader evolving ecosystem of innovative and diversified mobility services, like things like rideshare. Now, both of those things come with pros and cons, and our report goes into more of that in detail. But just to touch on here, kind of some of the risks that are associated with that for the sector include sustainability for community transport going forward and how that's going to work in that competitive market, but also broader systemic issues around potential market failures or inequalities that the government in particular probably needs to keep an eye on. And then for the sector itself, I think some of the challenges that exist around sector capacity, especially linked to that, because it's so diverse and disaggregated, I think its visibility and its collective capacity to do things like advocate for itself or engage, but also other issues around future workforce and the sustainability of that workforce, given things like high staff turnover, the heavy reliance of many of the providers on volunteers and that kind of thing. So taking together some of those create some specific barriers around innovation specifically. A lot of that's around funding and financial flexibility as well, which are both often very constrained and make it hard for a lot of providers to actually invest in new technology, but also the funding uncertainty, which makes both the appetite for risk around innovation as well as the actual sustainable adoption of innovative solutions really difficult for some providers. Challenges of scale occur as well, because a lot of community transport providers are relatively small, certainly when you compare them to most sort of mainstream transport providers. There's also some evidence from the research of kind of varying capacity and readiness for innovation in the sector. So while there's really strong pockets of innovation that exist, in other quarters there's sort of more cultural and attitudinal barriers, but also some kind of challenges around the capacity to implement solutions effectively. So, for example, because a lot of technology comes with a need for intensive training, upskilling, and that kind of thing. Customer barriers and readiness for technology is another issue, and that's a bit of a mix of kind of perception and reality. So there were pretty varying kind of perceptions amongst different stakeholders around the kind of readiness of community transport customers for new technology, but also some genuine barriers around use and adaptation of technology for some customers, for example, due to genuine kind of physical or cognitive impairments and that kind of thing. The final point is really around kind of the extent to which technology solutions are fit for the sector's needs. I think the sort of technology solutions that community transport providers need have to accommodate that sort of multi-layered regulatory compliance and reporting kind of set of regimes that they have to cope with, but also the very kind of complex and varied customer needs that they deal with day to day. Added to that, I think a lot of providers have previously had to face either quite prescriptive technical specifications or technology requirements, or in other cases, they've actually had previous negative experiences of technology implementation that make some providers hesitant to invest in or embrace technology. So those are some of the kind of key barriers at work when it comes to implementing new technologies in the sector. But, at the same time, our report does talk a lot about the opportunities. So, first and foremost, that's kind of technology. So, which does offer some clear benefits. I think at a broader level, while some community transport providers do view it as a threat, I think from a broader kind of strategic perspective, a lot of the wider transport innovations that are emerging around things like on-demand and mobility as a service can play an important role in improving mobility for people that experience transport disadvantage. So in terms of the broader role of technology in addressing the kind of community need, I think that shouldn't be forgotten. But also then for community transport providers themselves, a lot of the innovations we identified offer quite a lot of benefits if they're kind of viable around efficiency, productivity, integrating and aggregating user needs and services, streamlining compliance and administration, and just improving the quality, responsiveness and resilience of services for customers and a host of other things. There's also, I think, some opportunities for the sector itself in terms of its ability to be proactive in kind of building its own capacity, but also its kind of readiness for change. I think individual providers can respond to that kind of changing context I've described by sort of identifying where their opportunities for growth are, or for service innovation or diversification. And that's something that we've seen in other jurisdictions internationally. But even at a sector level, where there's opportunities to do more around knowledge sharing, capacity building, particularly across jurisdictions within Australia. And then I think a key message kind of from the research was about the strong evidence around the importance of forming partnerships. So kind of greater collaboration within the sector, where that offers opportunities to better leverage the collective scale and capacity of individual providers by doing things like aggregating needs or adopting more collaborative service models, but also then opportunities for more local partnerships or networks between community transport and other local health, social and community-based services. And then of course there's the role for or potential role for government and industry, for example, in partnering with providers to explore things like relevant use cases involving community transport and their customers. And that can include things like pilots and trials, and the role that things like that can play in helping both de-risk innovative solutions for the sector and others, but also, and potentially in a kind of relatively low risk way, but also to help demonstrate then the benefits and the return on investment. And then just kind of finally, more the kind of opportunities for systemic innovation. So that was more kind of at the service level and the sector level. And this is a bit more in terms of where the systemic opportunities or issues kind of are. I've already alluded, I guess, to the need to kind of improve the evidence base. And the opportunity there is really around doing so in a way that can better inform a kind of whole of government strategy that's kind of responsive to changing demands, and particularly focused on understanding the community needs around transport disadvantage, but also the relative costs and benefits of services, and then what that can tell us about where there are potential, for example, funding gaps or future needs that need to be kind of planned for, and so on. One of the other things we touch on is things like governance. So there's opportunities to establish better governance around some of these cross-cutting transport disadvantage issues, given the policy silos that are at work. And that includes across different areas and levels of government, but also between government and the community transport sector and other stakeholders. One of the other points is, with the shift to kind of a more competition-based market for services, again, while that might bring opportunities, I think there are potential risks or market failures there, and I think government needs to take some greater stewardship and monitoring of that in order to make sure that we don't end up in a market failure situation, especially when we're dealing with quite vulnerable communities who may lack other transport options. And then finally, I think there's an opportunity to explore, and it could be policy solutions, it could be technology solutions, but where there are things like that can be applied at a system-wide level to try and overcome some of those kind of customer barriers to accessing services that I touched on under the challenges. And then, there's really a sort of integration thing about how community transport can be better integrated or policy can be better integrated to service it. So whether that's about local and regional transport planning and thinking about, the customer need, but also thinking about community transport as part of the transport solution mix in sort of planning locally and regionally for transport needs, but also where there's opportunity for more integrated approaches to policy or funding within or even across jurisdictions. So that could be about consolidating funding streams or designing the funding mechanisms differently, for example, to kind of address some of the challenges I pointed to around flexibility of funding or those sorts of things, but also kind of things like adopting statewide coordinated models for procurement or management of transport assets like vehicles, or things like co-development of technology solutions, or even things like access to capital for providers. Last slide, promise. I've just attempted to kind of boil all of that down into just a few kind of key messages. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but just for the kind of community transport sector, mainly thinking about where the benefits are from technology and service innovation, and how individual providers and the sector collectively might position themselves to capitalise on some of those opportunities. For government agencies, mainly around responding to some of those systemic challenges around understanding and addressing future needs, the issues around market stewardship, but also the role that government can play in creating the conditions for success. And then for the wider transport and technology industry, mainly around where some of those key opportunities are, but also some of the considerations in engaging with the community transport sector. So that was a bit of a scamper through. There's a lot more in the report. I encourage you to read it, but thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Peter. That was a really great introduction to both how comprehensive the research was, but also how complex the sector is, but importantly, what are the opportunities are, particularly with regards to applications of technology and collaboration. So Ben and Simon, you've both been sitting there very patiently through that. And yeah, to Peter's point, I encourage you all to read the full 170-something page report. We also have a lighter version in an exec summary for those with a shorter attention span like myself. But to the industry side, Peter said we did speak with a lot of people. We had a lot of workshops. There's a huge amount of people involved in delivering community transport services and providing solutions to improve it. But we wanted to speak to some people that were working on the ground on both sides of those things. So we've invited, Ben Whitehorn and Simon Anthonitz to speak with us today. So Ben comes from the community transport side, and if I can ask you, Ben, and then Simon, to share a bit about the organisation you work for, and not just as a focus on the challenges that your organisation and sector faces, but what are the opportunities as well, and how you're looking at this going forward.
Thanks very much, Stacey. Yeah, my name's Ben Whitehorn. I'm the CEO of Randwick Waverley Community Transport. We're in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Basically, our patch is sort of the harbour to the north, the ocean to the east, Botany Bay to the south, and probably the city to the west, which is a fairly small geographic area, but highly congested. Our clients or participants or part of our team don't suffer from options. There's a transport option within 2 minutes of everywhere of here. Yet our phone runs off the hook. So the demand is certainly there, and it's not about lack of options. It's about level of service, perhaps. Before I go on too much further, though, on behalf of the industry, community transport, it's fantastic to see such players as iMove and ITS and UTS being involved and interested in community transport. Myself and a few others have been, knocking on your doors for a while, banging on about community transport, and this is the most comprehensive and thorough research project that I've seen on it. So, on behalf of the industry, it's great to see that you guys are, interested and engaged. So that's fantastic.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, you have been bothering us for a while with that, so thanks for continuing to do that. And Simon, you're kind of a bit newer as a technology provider, a software developer. So how did you come to community transport, and what's your engagement?
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. We have mobility in transport has been in our Orcoda brand for some 12 years, mostly boxes and pallets and large transport. But in 2018, we started into this sector and developed a focus around community transport just because of some of the issues they were looking to solve. And so that's been our introduction to the industry. I echo what Ben says. It's great to see it getting a podium here because, and from where Peter's research, I think there is a huge opportunity for technology to emerge in this sector. I know there's lots of technology around other parts of transport already, and funding and government support and popularity around it. But we are seeing huge change and huge opportunities in applying technology to community transport that doesn't necessarily affect the users, so it doesn't challenge the users, but helps the organisations deliver it. And that's what we do. We sit in the background, we help organisations change what they do, and our technology helps them, especially around aggregation and the benefits of that, obviously around trips and accessibility.
Thanks, Simon. Ben, to your point, I grew up in the eastern suburbs, and I grew up without really using a timetable because the service delivery was so high, which certainly the rest of Australia can't say. But when you say that the demand is there, the types of services you provide to your customers, how are they different from public transport, and where's that mix?
I think it's the element of care, certainly, that's that is probably most highly valued and most impactful. Transport's probably one of the first things, someone's ability to access services, especially as they get older, is one of the first things that goes. And it's amazing how quickly isolation can come in as soon as that goes, even within, the small communities or the very centralised communities that we work within. There's a lot of socially isolated, lonely people out there because they can't get, 5 kilometres down the road, and it's amazing how quick that happens. So I think the demand is from that person-centred approach, that certainty, that the care that taxis do an amazing job, but if we come around and pick someone up and they're not there, that ends with a call to the police, basically. So that level of service, whilst it's expensive, is unique to, certainly in transport terms, unique to a community transport service provision, and that is valued not just by clients but families, carers, all sorts of people. So I think that's where the demand lies. And as Peter rightly pointed out, the demographic Australia is ageing, and we're living longer, and so the spread of our clients is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So there's a lot of really fit 65-year-olds out there, but there's a lot of not so fit 65-year-olds, and now we're talking about the 95-year-olds. So that's a big demographic that needs to be looked after.
And Ben, you mentioned the cost, but that's the transport cost. When you think of Peter's, I suppose, interdisciplinary assessment of all of the sectors that are impacted, from social and health and others, I would imagine that cost dramatically drops when you're talking about keeping people in their homes, preventative medicine opportunities, and just, we know that loneliness, what they say is like akin to smoking now. So the benefits, the cumulative benefits you get from maintaining those services must outweigh the actual cost of that trip.
Oh, significantly, yeah. The early intervention piece, residential aged care, I won't bore you with all the numbers, but that's a super expensive process, and let's be honest, not something that any of us really want to deal with. We I don't think about it too much, and not many of us do, but it's a reality. So if you can, if you can keep people living in their own homes, part of their community, you provide, that's, there's economic benefits everywhere you look there. There's also, social, universal benefits to growing old. I want to grow old in part of my community, not locked out in some, aged care facility. So, the benefits are enormous, and certainly outweigh, I think, any cost, that, not any cost, but, the cost to provide those benefits.
Yeah. So to that complexity, so Simon, you're talking about all different organisations, from large, small, from transport to health to social. How do we get them all to effectively coordinate and collaborate and work together? Can technology provide solutions for that?
Look, absolutely. One thing we know, a bit like what Ben was saying, one thing we know with this cohort is they, in assisted transport, they're probably more predictable than public transport because they tend to go to appointments, and then, but you also need those appointments to be held. So that's one role of technology, is to make sure that that's visible and it can be achieved, and in our case planned before the event, which is really important, so that everyone's got an idea where it goes. With that, the technology can also help aggregate trips. It's a big thing. I say a lot about aggregation, not as an economic thing, but that's also sharing the trip. And, you've got some of those social benefits there that Ben talked about right in under your nose, rather than sending two vehicles, being able to put two people in the same vehicle under an organisation where they can share maybe some of the trip, but share some of the stories on the way. And of course, the economic benefit of aggregation is in kilometres and CO2 emissions and those types. So we're using fewer vehicles, or we're being able to provide more trips with the same vehicles.
Thanks, Simon. I just got distracted by a question. I have firm views about making public transport free, but probably won't share them today. But to your point, Ben, you were saying that, obviously lots of your customers can't use public transport. And then to your point, Simon, these kinds of services can be easier to logistically optimize because they're going to a specific time and place appointment. So these services are filling a gap that public transport can't provide. Is there ways to enhance or enable access to some public transport services or the modes of public transport to your customers to expand? There's a lot of demand out there, Ben, as you said, like to repurpose the public transport vehicles to your customers and vice versa.
I think there is. There's some, the first mile, last mile approach, which is, a really interesting piece. I think with any journey, it's the accessibility that needs to be from your front door to the front door of wherever you're going. And once that one small piece of that isn't, someone with a disability, for example, encounters some sort of like environment that they can't overcome, then that's no longer an accessible journey. So whilst it's good to think about and efficient to try and think about the last mile, first mile sort of concepts, it's really important that whatever's in between is accessible and usable for that client group. Sometimes the fact is that people get to a stage in terms of their lack of mobility that they don't have any other option than to have a vehicle pull up at their front door, someone assist them from their front door into the vehicle, and then on the other side provide that. Economically, that's not what people want to hear. In reality, that's what we're faced with, on a daily basis.
Simon, can the technology manage the complexity of integrating with the mass transit system to provide that bulk where then the edge use cases that Ben were talking about can be expensive ones?
Look, I think so. I think what we know is that Ben's case there, you couldn't provide with a public transit or a generic, you might need a cared, an experienced or trained worker, but the asset being put back into mass or potential mass customers joining in that asset trip to make it more effective or more efficient that way, that definitely needs technology, because they both need to be seats available or direction of travel and all those types of metrics that we talk about. I couldn't see the mass replacing some of the really important assisted transport, but I could certainly see assisted coming back and pulling into the mass pool or sharing in the mass pool.
I think that gets back to one of the other things that came up during the conversations with stakeholders and at the workshops, that it really is the community in community transport. It might seem facile, but that's kind of where it sits. So to your point, Simon and Ben, the workforce that you have, they're integral to be able to provide these services effectively, because they're the front-facing folks that are talking to the customers, whether it's through the call center or the route mapping. So what do you see as sort of the development of workforce, whether from drivers or to the carers? Ben?
Yeah, just going back to Simon's point, I agree. Technology, plays an enormous part, and that aggregation piece is so important for economies of scale and what we're trying to do to make things more realistic. But the really good technologies are the ones where we're dealing with people. So anything that can be customizable or manually changed, because there's significant barriers to, not everyone can use an iPhone just yet. Not everyone can, even use a phone. People, there's reasons people can't use all sorts of technology. So as long as you have that customizable ability within your software, within your technology to provide that assist that Simon's talking about when required, then that's the piece of technology that we need, and then you can build your workforce around that.
Yeah, another workforce consideration, Stacey, is potentially where we've seen case study like this where you have multiple providers potentially sharing a technology. So it's probably the opposite. It's a way of doing the same job for 4 or 5 different providers with one technology and one sort of planner or dispatcher. Now, rather than put 3 others out of work, it's about, can those people become more specialist in the customer care side? I know Ben and other providers would be the same. If they had 10 more people who could take phone calls or assist in the transport and weren't bogged down in the admin of the transport, that would probably be a benefit.
Yeah, agreed.
Ben, you were saying you in eastern suburbs is pretty much the most highly densely populated place in Australia. But as it's Australia, we absolutely need to consider our rural and regional folks. So what are the learnings or the research, and Peter, you could answer to this as well, from the investigation that you've had or the conversations that you've had that could take some of these innovations or opportunities out to rural and regional environments?
I think certainly that aggregation piece, Stacey, where, how big is Australia? If you've got an asset, hurtling down the road somewhere and then the next asset's potentially 4 or 5 hours away, if you can aggregate that service, there's significant benefit in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. I think, aggregation is a large part of the kind of solution to some of that in terms of making those things viable. In terms of efficiency and productivity and so on. But I think a large part of the issue is the how you get there, and the sorts of models you need to put in place to enable it, whether that's about the kind of collaborative partnerships that you form between different organizations, and then, and that could be both, that could be just organizations doing similar services and sharing assets, or it could be about how you get a set of different providers that, I think to Simon's earlier point, can all leverage the same technology platform in a way that none of them are able to do on their own for reasons of scale or something else, but actually when you combine forces, it becomes a lot more viable. There's also, other things around where individual or collective providers can start looking at things like diversification, or other forms of kind of innovation in terms of what they might offer. I think there was a question from John about things like in the Q&A about moving small parcels as well as people, and things like freight as a service as well as mobility as a service in a kind of community transport context, or any kind of regional transport context would be interesting. And it's certainly one of many examples of the sorts of things you could do. I think it's then for individual providers and for the sector to think about what works for them.
Yeah, interesting, Peter, the aggregation of the technology rather than the aggregation of the vehicles, and it does bring scale 100%.
And I think that's one example of where, some of the things we talk about in the research about how the community transport sector can leverage its collective capacity to operate more efficiently. So, even if that's, and, there's potentially roles for government in statewide coordinated approaches to things like procurement of assets or management of assets, or, kind of collaboration between providers around training staff, or, there's all sorts of options. I think it's just about exploring them, and quite often just forming the partnerships to actually explore the possibilities is where some of the barriers still exist.
That might answer to, or broadly answer to one of the questions we've regards to additional levers that there might be to enable access, more equitable access to community transport beyond price. I mean, not that you want for somebody that's using community transport to pop a parcel in their lap to carry it to somewhere else, but we talked about the fact that there is latent demand out there, that there are other people that might know about the service availabilities that just either sitting at home or could be going somewhere or could be engaging more socially or getting better access to services and just aren't familiar because they might be younger, they might have a chronic illness, they might be temporarily disabled. So is there a way of reaching out to that? Obviously economies of scale mean that the more people that you have using the services, the more expensive they are, but then you get better service provision. But if we're not factoring everything by cost, what are some of the opportunities that we could, I suppose, use there from government to industry?
I think it would be a good point potentially to make to government in order maybe to get some more support about how the aggregation can reduce vehicles on road, emissions, kilometres travelled, wait times. That role that Ben and his providers promote daily, they're taxed the same way as a lot of vehicles. They're probably thrown in the pile with all of these vehicles on the road doing transport, but they're far different. I'd like to see that we could push that barrow back up the hill and say, look at what we're doing. We don't get like we said at the start, we don't always get the attention, but look at what the CT group is doing to reduce that and reduce congestion and emissions. And the way it's done is by working together.
I think there's definitely something in what you say, Stacey, about I think the reach to customers or potential customers, and certainly technology is going to have an increasing role in that, and that's really just part of where transport is going. I think the implications of that for the community transport sector around kind of getting to grips with data, so that where transport becomes increasingly visible and accessed through technology platforms, community transport is part of the suite of stuff that's appearing there and is not invisible. I think that's crucial for the sector in terms of understanding, but also then what role for either industry or government in terms of helping the kind of interoperability around that and helping build the sector's capacity to engage with and make sure it's engaged in those platforms, I think is really important. And whether that's about kind of standardized frameworks or something else, I think it's something that probably needs to look, but also making sure that CT is being brought into the conversation about things like how's mobility as a service going to work, and how do we make sure that the people that are most reliant on, most vulnerable and most reliant on things like community transport don't get left behind as a result in terms of inequitable access to the benefits of technology.
Yeah, you mentioned the data issue. I know, Ben, you carry lots of rich data on your customers. They're not necessarily in the folders and they're covered behind you, so they're all online somewhere. So how do we manage the utility of that data that you need to provide the services effectively, but when it's intersected with transport data, they're kind of the most sensitive personal data you can possibly have, your health and transport, providing secure platforms to enable the sharing of that data across providers and users? Is that?
Yeah, look, that's certainly an issue. As you say, the detail we require to provide that safe and secure service for anyone, with mobility needs, disabilities, whichever, is vital to be able to provide that service. So, privacy issues and sharing all that type of data is a serious concern, and probably best left to people smarter than me like Simon to work that out. But yeah, look, it needs to be done, absolutely. And just as more important is the fact that you have access to that data so that you can provide the appropriate service for the appropriate people.
That was a nice handball, Ben. I won't comment on the data privacy either, but the data that helps deliver the transport is not so much the personal data, but that predictability of trips. The fact that I know that Ben's got somebody traveling to this postcode is on a every Monday is only because Ben's put that person into this shared environment to say, look, hand up, this person needs to be joined into one of your trips. And there's possibly some work around the privacy, you're right, Ben, but if we had the same platform and the same goal and we were actively sharing it, that's only a benefit.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, we've only got 9 minutes left. I think there's another comment with regards to deployment of smaller size vehicle fleet for older people or disabled people to be able to use for personal trips. And I think there are some applications of, say, automated shuttles in certain operational design domains, but I'm not sure, and I take your professional advice on this, Ben, that just giving people personal mobility devices is going to solve the problems that we're facing.
Oh, look, it will solve the, perhaps the 70-80%, but the 70-80% perhaps can, utilise public transport or whatever that initiative is. We're probably more concerned about that 20% that can't.
Yeah.
So, the idea that automated vehicles and, that type of thing is going to be a solution in this area. I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, for some people, but for some people, the fact is that we're the last resort often, and it's not good to think about community transport as the last option, because we're not the last option. But, for someone with complex needs and no other option, it's us or, the next option's an ambulance, basically. So, that it's a vital service, and it works in thin markets often, and that makes it expensive because sometimes you can't aggregate. I mean, community transport we're the original rideshare. We've been doing this for 40 years and we just didn't present ourselves as well as Uber did. Otherwise, we'd have investors everywhere. But the fact is, some people just can't get in a vehicle with other people and aggregate and, all the wonderful things that, will make things more efficient. Sometimes you just need, that extra level of service, which is what we provide, and, we provide it really well.
And I think we all hope that we would get that level of service when we need it as well. So you don't want to go for the cheapest supplier when you're providing a service for someone that, is in your family or might be you one day.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys. There's some other comments in there, and yes, there are some really useful trials that are being run. Some in Victoria and some in New South Wales, and certainly in Queensland, that's worthwhile investigating. On-demand services. There's always going to be those thin edge cases that Ben's talking about, and we're hoping that some technology deployments can help us resolve some of the problems so that we can get some economies of scale and get these benefits out to a broader cross section of the community. So, Leanne, I'll ask you. I've been talking a lot to thank everyone and wrap up. Oh, just quickly, we have a workshop that we're continuing this discussion. So at Mobility 2022, which is in June 15th to 16th this year, we'll be running a workshop for this cohort to have a continued conversation around community transport and technology. So get in contact if you're interested in attending that. That's me. Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks very much, Stacey. I'd like to thank the panelists and participants. At this point, I'd like to unashamedly give a plug for iMove. As this wonderful project demonstrates, with 6 partners across 4 states, we bring together multiple parties across jurisdictions to undertake applied research that promotes efficient, sustainable transport solutions. We do that as well as invest money in those projects and expertise. We also assist in the successful delivery of those projects. So we invite everyone who's on the call to please feel free to contact us if there's an area of transport and mobility that you would like to explore. I would also like to thank the panelists and the participants for their time today, and just a note to let everyone know that the recording of this session will be available tomorrow. And yes, that's the end of the webinar. Thanks to everybody for participating, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.